Hello, Bobby Torres of Frightbox recording here explaining how to make your own drum samples and then how to load them into Slate Trigger. The first half of the tutorial where I actually show you how to make the samples, these samples can be loaded into any drum triggering software. I've decided to extend the tutorial and show you how to load it into Trigger specifically because so many people use Trigger these days, including myself. I used to use a program called Drummergog, which is great as well, but I found Trigger to be just way more accurate at the end of the day. So with that being said, why would you even want to make your own drum samples? For me, there are two primary reasons. The first, when you're using drum samples of the actual kit that you used within a production, the samples will tend to blend really easily with the rest of the kit, meaning the overheads and the rooms. That's the first reason, just because they're part of the, it's uniform, it's all part of the same source sound. The second reason is you'll end up with your own unique sounding production. For example, like if the production I'm working on, I want to go for a higher pitched snare, I'll tune the snare higher and I'll sample it. If I'm going for something that's more of a doom thing, I'll tune the snare lower and then take samples of that. I know that the samples are unique to the production I'm working on. The first thing you're going to want to do in order to capture your own drum samples is actually record them on drum day. So what I do to keep the kick and snare sounding kind of natural, because if you have your drummer just hit kick drums and then hit a bunch of snare drums at full velocity, they will end up sounding strange, because in reality, when someone's playing, they're not gonna hit at full velocity while they're playing cymbals, while they're keeping count, and while they're vibing with the song. So I'll just have them play a simple kick, snare, kick, kick, snare, kick, snare, kick, kick, snare pattern. It sounds extremely boring, and believe me, it is boring to record, and your drummer will probably be bored doing it, but it's worth it because it'll end up with a very natural sounding kick and snare sample collection to choose from. So I have an example here. Before I start chopping stuff up, I'm gonna play for you a quick sample of what I make drummers go through when I'm taking samples. Let's check this out. So here's the kick and snare. Okay, so extremely boring, but those hits are way more realistic than if you have, your drummer just slam on the kick drum a bunch of times and then slam on the snare drum a bunch of times. If I'm taking intentionally lighter samples, which I do from time to time, then I could do that in isolation. But when I want a more powerful, just a powerful collection of kick and snare samples, I'll have them do it like that. The toms I am not as strict with because I do not completely sample replace my toms at all. But I do take tom samples just in case I have to fly in a few if there's too much cymbal bleed in the actual drum performance. But I have them just in case. I barely ever use them. So if you look here, yeah, you see a bunch of my tom hits. I'll even play a section. Okay, that's my rack tom, my floor tom. Okay, and then at the end I have some cymbal hits. Just my ride, crash, China, just in case when I go to edit, there's some funkiness happening and I have to fly in a cymbal. I'm gonna be honest with you, I do this, but I almost never need the cymbal samples at all, but you never know, so it is good. Like let's say your drummer hits his China just a little too light on a super duper important section of the song. If you have a harder China hit, you can fly it in. Again, I don't use it much, but I do grab them just in case. So without any further ado, I'm gonna explain to you how I chop these up. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna work on the kick drum. So like I said, you have your kick and snare hits that were played in a very simple, straightforward beat. I'm gonna just grab all of these kicks and I'm gonna copy just the kicks over to a section of their own. Okay, so now what we have is a bunch of kick hits. So let's take a listen. Okay, so those few kick hits that we just listened to sounded pretty good, but as you could tell, you hear some of the snare actually bleeding through the kick drum mic. So what we need to do is we need to chop these up and completely get rid of that extra snare resonance that's bleeding through. So the first thing I do, after I drag it to its own section, is I line it up to any random grid line, and I start chopping these up. I tab to each transient, and mind you, I listened and made sure to, because I usually sample between 5 and 10 kick hits and 5 and 10 snare hits. In this case, I'm just gonna do 5 just to keep the video shorter. If for some reason one of the hits is bad, you wanna listen and make sure you do not sample this and then load it into your plugin and then realize after your whole production is done that some of those hits are a little funky. So like I said, just take your time and make sure each hit is the way you want it to sound. In this case, the first 5 sounded pretty good to me. So we're gonna chop just those first 5 hits. So let's do that. Cut. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hits here. So as you can see, that snare transient is still here. We're gonna get rid of this, get rid of this, get rid of that. All right, so we have 5 separated kick hits that we need to now clean up before we consolidate it and make actual files out of them. So what I like to do is I grab them here, okay. Okay, to keep things nice and clean visually, I just inserted each one on a downbeat, just so they're all starting in the same spot. So let's take a listen to what these sound like. Okay, so yeah, they're all starting at the same point in time. Not that they have to be rhythmically correct or anything, but just so I could visually see that they are all the same length. Obviously, right now, they're not all the same length, so we need to fix that. So what I'm gonna do, all right, I have my grid set to 1/8 notes, I think. Yeah, 1/8 notes. I'm gonna make all of the audio files just an 1/8 note long, so they're uniform. It's up to you. If your kick drum has a little more resonance, maybe you'll have to make it, you know, a 1/4 note in length. This kick is very tight sounding and very kind of punchy, so it doesn't have to be any longer than an 1/8 note. So I'm gonna cut the end, cut the end, cut the end, cut the end, and cut the end. Okay, so now all of our kick drums are the exact same length. Let's check them and make sure that nothing sounds weird. Let's check it out. Good. Good, 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 good. Okay, so now we need to apply fades to the beginnings and ends of all of these files so there are no weird clicks and pops. You may not hear it now, but when you actually use these within a mix, these are raw right now, but when you use them in a mix and you start compressing stuff, it'll bring out any weird edits that may or may not have been taken care of in this phase of your drum sample making process. Okay, so this works the same way in any DAW. I'm using Pro Tools, but in order to apply fades in Pro Tools, you pull up your fade dialog box, and I have all of mine preset to 5 milliseconds on the way in and 5 milliseconds on the way out. This 5 milliseconds is for crossfades, but we're not using crossfades. We're only fading in and out. So I'm gonna apply these fades. Okay, and our fade should be, there you go. So we have a fade in and we have a fade out. But there is a problem here, okay? If you look really closely at the beginning of the transient, we do not want this. What's happening here is the fade is actually cutting off the beginning of the kick transients, and we do not want that, okay? So what I'm gonna do, you can nudge the audio within a clip. Most DAWs you could do this. In Pro Tools, it's done a little differently, but it's the same concept where you keep your audio files where they are and you simply nudge the audio within them back a little without moving the actual clip on the timeline. I'll show you. So I'm gonna keep all of my clips where they are, and I'm going to just nudge it back 10 milliseconds. So now, if you look, there's your kick transient, and there's your fade. So the fade is fading the beginning of the audio file, but it is not cutting off any of the actual transient itself. So there you have it. We have 5 nice, clean, hard kick hits, realistically hard again. They're not super duper slammed out and sounding artificial. Let's take a listen to them and make sure there are no weird clicks or pops. There you go. Okay, so now, we just chopped all this up, but we did not make files yet, okay? So if I were to drag this audio out, yeah, see? These are not consolidated files, so we need to consolidate each of these individual files. I know in Reaper it's called glue, and in Logic it's called something else. In Pro Tools it's called consolidate. Pretty much what you're doing is you're making brand new files that are only audio that we visually see right now in our timeline. So I'm gonna consolidate each of these. Okay, so now we have, if you look, there's no more fade, but that's all right because the fade is baked into the actual audio file. And if I try to drag this out, I can't because it's a solid file, it's a whole file. The next step, super important. I see a lot of newer guys, when they get into audio production, they're very disorganized with their file management. Trust me, I used to be like this, be organized. It's gonna make your life a million times easier. If you look at these titles, kick_01, kick_02. Okay, you don't want that. You want to come up with a naming system that you use over and over and over again, so it's very easy for you to keep your files organized. I'm gonna call this kick-1, so that's the first sample. Kick-2. Okay, so now if we look in our audio files folder, there we are. These are our brand new kick files that we just made that we can bring into any piece of software that we need to. Even if you're programming hip hop beats, these are some nice samples that you could actually use, which I have done before. But anyway, so let's move on to our snare drum. We're gonna go back to the same section. Okay, let's take a listen to these snare hits and see if there's anything weird going on. Okay, right off the bat, I did not like those first two. Okay, those 5 are okay. So let's chop these up in the same manner. So drag this back. Okay, so it's the exact same process that we applied to the kick. So I'm gonna make them all an 1/8 note. Okay, I'm gonna fade them, right? And now we're gonna look. Yeah, see, that's bad. You do not want to consolidate your files where the transient is being cut off like that. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna highlight all of our clips and we're gonna nudge it back by a few milliseconds. Okay, so there you go. So now our samples should be nice and clean. Let's take a listen. Okay, and just like with the kick, let's consolidate each one. Now, mind you, there are faster ways of consolidating files. I'm just going through it step by step so you can see in detail how I do this. Okay, we're gonna rename all of these. So I'm gonna name it S for snare, 1, S. Okay, so just in the interest of keeping this video from being insanely long, I'm gonna just make samples with these two, with just the kick and a snare. It depends on your production. You may want to also make samples of lighter snare hits for like blast beats. You may even wanna do it with your toms. I know there are a lot of engineers that do prefer to sample replace all their toms, and that's awesome. I personally am not a fan of that myself, but that's just my own personal style. But it is the exact same process. Just make sure that, if you're doing toms, that the decay, you let it decay out. You don't want to chop them as tightly as I did with the kick and snare here. Also, if I'm doing a snare that has a longer decay, I will want to make it, a little longer in time before I fade it out. In this case, I'm just making them quick little 1/8 notes. And again, it's all relative to your tempo. Like in this case, it's at 120, so an 1/8 note at 120 is the length that you just saw. But the process is the same, okay? Okay, so from here, now our samples are made. They should be in our audio files folder. So let's take a look. Okay, so date modified, right? Here are my 5 kick samples, and here are my 5 snare samples. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna copy these samples into my sample library. Okay, and I have a folder called wave files that I keep all of my samples in when they're in their raw state. So let's say drum sample video. Okay, so I'm gonna take these 10 hits, my 5 kick hits, my 5 snare hits, and I'm gonna copy them over. So there you go. Now, these samples can be used anywhere. Like I said before, if you are using a plugin that is not Slate Trigger, you're good to go. From this point on, in the tutorial, I'm going to show you how to actually load them into Slate Trigger. So I always keep the raw wave file versions before I make the Slate samples, meaning like before I make the custom Slate Trigger samples. I keep them in a separate folder that I do not touch, just in case I switch plugins in the future. Okay, if you are a Slate Trigger user, after you've already copied your files into your sample library, what you need to do now is you need to make a new TCI file. And the way you do that is you use a piece of software that comes with the actual Trigger plugin. I think it installs automatically, I have it down here. It's called the Trigger Instrument Editor. And you need this in order to create these files. So what you need to do, open up your software here, right? You need to set the directory to where the source samples are. And the way you do that is you go here, select directory. In my case, it's already pointing to my sample library. It all depends on where you keep your files on your computer. So you just set the directory to wherever you keep your files. For me, it's here, and today we drag the samples into drum sample video. This is the folder. So now you hit open, and it's telling Slate Trigger that these are the samples you want to use. So here are our 10 hits, our 5 kicks, and our 5 snares. Now, if you notice here, there are these rows. This is for your actual velocity. If you're making multi-velocity samples, you can have like, your super soft snares here, a little harder, and then hardest. I found that might be a little overkill in most applications. If I'm gonna do that, I would actually just make a whole different TCI file for all my soft hits, and then all of my medium hits will be, again, another TCI file. If you do it this way, you're keeping everything in the same TCI file. The problem with that is that you have to be very, very strict with your triggering, because if something mistriggers and it thinks it's a softer hit when it's not, then you have to go back and correct everything. I'd rather just have a whole separate file to draw from in that case. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna make my rows just a single row. There we go. And I'm going to add another 4 columns, so that way we can import our 5 kick hits. So right now there's 1 column, but we're gonna make it 5. There you go. So we're gonna select our 5 kick hits, drag this in, and there we go. It has imported our 5 kick hits into this file. Now, you see this thing called articulation? You can actually have multiple articulations within a single TCI file. What an articulation would be is like different sections of the snare, like, like a rim shot or something. I don't go that crazy with it. Again, I keep things as simple as possible. If I were to do rim shots, I would just make, again, a whole separate TCI file. That's just my own personal style. If you want to make very, very advanced TCI files, that's totally up to you. The capabilities are there. I just like to keep things simple. Okay, so now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna name this articulation just something simple, so we know, just gonna name it kick. Again, because we are not using multiple articulations, I do not use that. The capabilities are there if you need it. I'm just gonna name it kick. So now what we need to do is we need to save this actual TCI file somewhere. Again, trust me, be nice and organized, it's way easier. So I'm gonna save this in its own folder. Okay, so here's my Frightbox samples folder. My Frightbox samples folder has all of my own custom samples. There's a wave files folder that are my source raw wave files. I always keep them just in case I'm gonna switch plugins down the road, but I keep them in my Slate plugin folder just so everything's organized, and I'm gonna name this folder Drum Samples Video. There we go. Okay, and this TCI file we're gonna call kick, because it's our kick. There you go. So now let's do the same thing for our snare. So we need to make a new TCI file. So let's say new instrument, right? We're gonna make it just a single row, just like before, okay? 5 columns, because we have 5 samples. There we go, let's call it snare. Good, okay, save instrument, snare. Okay, so now if we go back and we look in our actual folder here, drum samples video, we have a kick TCI file and a snare TCI file. What's great about this is now we have our samples in 2 places. We have our raw samples that we can use in any other plugin we need, and now we have our Slate samples that we can load directly into the Slate plugin. So let's see how we do that. Okay, we're gonna go to our browser here, and let's see, drum sample video, there we go. Let's drag our kick here. And that is our multi-sample. Our 5 hits are self-contained within this file. So now every time this sample is triggered, it's randomly triggering one of those hits. It'll never be 2 of the same ones in a row to keep it sounding as natural as possible. That's what I love about Slate Trigger. So now if we need to load our snare, that's our multi-sample of our snare in its raw state. That's the other thing I love about making your own samples, is that they are just the raw sounds. So you can mix them just like a normal snare drum or a normal kick drum. When you're using pre-made samples, the thing I'm not too crazy about is that they're generally processed. And that can be a good or bad thing. It depends on your own style. For me, it is not the best thing. I prefer to process as little as possible. So I always lean towards using my own self-made samples, just like we made in this video. So, okay, so now I'm gonna show you how I actually use it in real. Once I lay in all the samples, how do I mix with these things? Let's check it out. Okay, so here's a mix that I've done where I'm actually using the exact same samples that we just made previously. It's from the same sample set, the same session, where I'm blending the samples that I've made with the rest of the kit. So you have your kick right here. The natural kick is muted in this section of the song. It may or may not pop in if I want more dynamics for like a slower section, but in this part of the song, it is completely muted, and I'm only using the kick sample. So that is unmuted. The snare is a 50-50 mix between the sample and the live snare. Now, a lot of people seem to be confused about this. They ask me, why do I blend a sample of the exact same snare drum in with the live snare? Why wouldn't you use a different sound? And I may do that from time to time. Like I may mix in a higher pitched sample that I've recorded with a lower pitched snare or vice versa. But I found that when you have a sample of the original snare and you blend it in, it adds extra, kind of like extra girth and extra punch in a very natural and pleasing way. It's almost like parallel compression in a way, but it's not that you're compressing it anymore, it's that the sample is obviously less dynamic. It adds a lot of extra reinforcement in a natural way. Okay, so let's take a listen to the sample. We're using the same sounds that we've previously just chopped up and imported into Slate Trigger. Let's check it out. Okay, so I'm a big fan of that type of sound where obviously it's super duper tight, it's super duper punchy, but it still has some natural warmth to it. And again, that's why I like to make my own drum samples, because you're working with the raw tones that you captured during the actual recording, and they're not processed, they're not super duper bright, they're not super duper compressed. And there you have it. Now you know how to make your own drum samples. Again, I went into extra detail showing you how to do it in Slate Trigger because so many people use Slate Trigger these days. I figured it was worth it. But those WAV files you could use in any sampler under the sun. They are just standard mono WAV files of the source sounds. Also, if you would like to download my free impulse response that you could load into your guitar sim plugins, the link is in the description below. It should make dialing a guitar tone way easier. It was mic'd with an SF57 on a V30 within an oversized Mesa 4x12, which is my favorite cab for recording metal and rock guitars. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And until next time, happy recording.